Long before dawn, a deadly frost swept onto the Dakota plains like a silent predator, weeks early and hungry for every living thing in its path. When Isaac Rowan opened his cabin door, half his field was already turning to ice under the moonlight. With barely an hour to act, he faced a choice that would decide not just his harvest, but his family's survival. Out here, one wrong move meant winter would claim everything, and the cold had already chosen its target. The Dakota Territory in the late 1800s could change from warm to bitter in a single night, but even so, this cold felt wrong. Autumn usually drifted in slowly, marked by cool mornings, orange cottonwood leaves, and the distant honking of migrating geese. Yet on this morning, the temperature had plunged to 26 degrees, an abrupt drop that iced the grass as if winter had slipped in through a crack in the sky. The cabin's windows were rimmed with white, though the fire inside had burned until midnight. Isaac stepped into the yard, boots crunching on a surface that should have been soft soil, and stared across his 8 acres of corn and beans. Their leaves glittered like broken glass. A faint blue haze hovered above the field. It was frost vapor, rising where the cold bit deepest. The rows nearest the low ground were already ruined, leaves curled inward and stalks stiff as bone. Those higher on the slight rise still looked alive, though the sheen of moisture on them threatened to freeze at any moment. Isaac exhaled, watching his breath drift straight north instead of swirling away. That alone told him something was off. On normal autumn mornings, wind slid from the west or the south. A north wind before dawn meant a pressure dive, and on the prairie, that meant trouble. He crouched, pressing his hand into the soil. It felt colder than the air, a sign he had learned from an elderly Lakota neighbor who once told him that the earth warmed before the sky did. Isaac had never forgotten that lesson. Newcomers relied on the almanac, but almanacs did not smell the soil, listen to the birds, or track the sudden stillness of the plains. Frontier families learned to trust the land itself, not predictions printed hundreds of miles away. And today, despite the date, the land said the season had turned early. He rose slowly, scanning the horizon. The sky was unusually clear, almost metallic, the sort of clarity that arrived just before a deep freeze. Even the animals had moved differently last night. The horses paced restlessly in the corral. A fox had skirted the edge of the yard near dusk, moving fast as if trying to reach shelter. Isaac remembered how the crickets had gone quiet too soon, their usual nighttime chatter falling away in a silence so crisp it felt carved. 8 acres, that was all he had. Corn for winter flour, beans to stretch stews when snowdrifts sacked up 8 or 10 feet high. Losing even a third of the crop meant rationing by November. Losing half meant swapping labor for food with neighbors already stretched thin. Losing all would leave his wife and 2 children facing the type of hunger frontier families whispered about but rarely admitted aloud. He walked toward the field, counting the rows automatically the way he always did in moments of stress. 32 rows of corn, 15 of beans. Enough, if he saved them, to survive the coming cold. But frost traveled like spilled water. Once it touched a leaf, it crept cell by cell, freezing sap and rupturing plant tissue. A single hour could decide whether the crop lived or died, and the first rays of sunlight would accelerate the damage. Frost under sunlight was far more lethal than frost in darkness. Isaac ran a hand along his jaw, rough with 2 days of stubble. He knew there were ways to fight a killing frost. Old farmers sometimes lit smudge fires, letting the drifting smoke trap warm air near the plants. Others rushed to soak the crops, banking on water's heat-holding ability to shield leaves from freezing. There were even stories, half legend, half truth, of settlers creating makeshift wind barriers that redirected cold air around low patches of field. But every method had a price. Every method took time. And time was the one thing he did not have. He smelled the cold again, sharp and almost metallic. He remembered his father's voice, not in dialogue but in memory, reminding him that the first frost each year always tested judgment more than labor. The challenge was not strength, but timing, choosing the right tactic before the freeze finished its work. A thin band of fog shaped itself along the lowest edge of the field. It moved differently than normal fog. It did not spread or drift. It pooled, as if something beneath the surface pulled it downward. Isaac narrowed his eyes. Low spots were always dangerous. Cold air, being heavier, flowed downhill like water and settled in basins. Many newcomers planted fields without understanding that simple truth. Isaac had learned quickly. After his first year on the prairie, he shifted half his planting uphill, sacrificing yield for survivability. But today, even the high rows were threatened. He stepped closer to the mist, boots sinking into brittle grass. The frost sparkled in a strange pattern here, almost in lines, as if the cold had not settled at random but followed an invisible path. Isaac knelt, studying the crystals. They grew thicker in certain bands, lighter in others. He frowned. Frost was supposed to spread evenly across exposed surfaces unless wind or terrain shaped it. But here it seemed to curve, rising and falling like a subtle wave. He touched one of the heavier bands with a gloved finger and felt an unexpected difference. The ground beneath that strip was harder, colder, almost frozen solid, while a strip only 3 feet away felt warmer. That meant moving air, a drainage of cold, a flow. He stood slowly, realization forming. If he could track the movement of cold air across the field, if he could understand its pattern, he might be able to disrupt it. And if he disrupted it, even briefly, he could buy the plants enough warmth to survive until sunrise fully cleared the danger. It would not be easy. It would require speed and a method no newcomer would consider. But it might save the crop. The wind shifted again, a faint sigh from the north, brushing through the corn like a warning. Isaac took one more step toward the mist, watching the frost patterns tighten into a shape he had never seen so clearly before. And then he saw it. Not just a pattern, but a path. A channel in the land itself that the cold was using like a hidden road. What he discovered in that moment would change everything. Frost did not strike evenly. It crept along dips in the land, rode cold air currents, and settled into pockets settlers often overlooked. Isaac knew this, but the frost before him behaved differently, moving with a precision that suggested intention. Something in the land itself seemed to funnel the cold where it could cause the most damage, and that realization pulled him into a moment where knowledge meant survival. The Dakota Territory had always known early frosts. In the 1870s and 1880s, cold snaps sometimes arrived before the cottonwoods even turning yellow. Old-timers told stories of mornings when livestock water froze a 1/4 inch thick, though the previous afternoon had been warm enough to work without coats. Indigenous families had their own reading techniques, passed through generations. The way low-hanging mist clung to creek beds, the heaviness in the air that settled just before dawn, even the silence of insects. They understood microclimates long before settlers built cabins here, and they respected the cold air pools that gathered quietly in low pockets across the plains. Isaac had learned some of those signs by observation, some by listening, and some through hard mistakes. Now, standing near the thin mist drifting along the edge of his field, he saw a pattern much clearer than any he had recognized before. A shallow swale curved across the land for nearly 100 yards, beginning just beyond the bean rows and bending gently toward the corn. It was easy to miss in summer when grasses masked every dip, but today the frost revealed it starkly, a pale ribbon where cold gathered and thickened. It was a perfect cold trap, a natural trough designed to collect the heaviest air and guide it downhill. Isaac moved along the edge of the swale, measuring the frost by hand. Frontier farmers often checked frost depth by the stiffness of the upper leaf layers, counting how many tiers of a plant had hardened. 2 layers meant surface frost, survivable with care. 3 layers meant the plant's vascular tissue was at risk. He touched one curled corn leaf. The top 2 layers felt brittle, but the third still had some give. That meant he had at most an hour before irreversible damage set in, maybe less if the sun broke over the horizon too quickly. Eastern farmers rarely dealt with these sudden strikes. Their land was more wooded, their fields sheltered by hills and broader tree belts.
Out here, the prairie was open and exposed. Frost didn't simply drop, it flowed. Newcomers brought methods from the east, smudge fires, late-night waterings, even blankets, but most didn't understand that on the prairie, topography ruled. A few feet of elevation could save a row, a shallow swale could wipe out an acre. Isaac had learned to walk the land before planting, tracing how the wind curled through grass or how fog traveled after rain. Those observations were as essential to survival as any tool in his barn.
As he trailed the frost line, he heard the crunch of footsteps behind him. Thomas Greer approached from the fence line, collar turned up, breath hanging in white clouds. Greer was strong and capable, but stubborn in the way some frontier men were, relying on what worked for their fathers back in Ohio or Virginia. He had once called Isaac's habit of watching soil temperature chasing ghosts in the dirt, and though the words were spoken without malice, the tone carried dismissal. "Cold morning," Greer said, in his dry, skeptical way, not as dialogue, but as a remembered cadence Isaac had heard many times. Isaac didn't respond aloud. Speech wasted time, and the frost spread too fast for conversation. Greer peered across the field, shaking his head in disbelief. He still trusted dates over signs. He still believed frost obeyed the calendar. Isaac knew better. He left Greer behind and knelt again, pressing his palm deeper into the soil. The earth felt close to freezing. A thin crust formed just beneath the surface, a sign that the ground temperature had fallen dangerously low, likely within a degree or two of solidifying. That meant the cold wasn't just on the leaves, it was seeping into the root zone. If the roots froze, no amount of warming later would save the plants. He stood and followed the curve of the swale as it arced closer to the main stand of corn. The frost grew thicker in this direction, stiffening into a hard sheen that caught the early glimmer of dawn. It felt like watching a slow-moving tide consume the land. His gut tightened. The pace of spread was accelerating. He estimated between 45 and 60 minutes remained before the majority of the field suffered a full kill. If he didn't act before the sun crested the horizon, the damage would be final. He scanned the field for any advantage. Frost followed cold, and cold followed terrain. If he could interrupt that flow, redirect it, block it, slow it, he stood a chance. But traditional tactics wouldn't work fast enough. Smudge fires took too long to build and required still air. Watering the field in this temperature risked flash freezing the plants, and hauling brush or canvas was impossible without more hands. He needed something immediate, something that could produce warmth higher and faster than the frost's advance. The air felt heavier here. Even his breath seemed to fall instead of rise. Isaac lifted his eyes toward the barnyard at the edge of the property. Through the low light, he noticed a faint shimmer above the compost pile near the fence. It was a barely visible ripple, a distortion that only someone trained to read small signs would recognize. At first, he thought it was smoke, but the color was wrong. Then he realized what it was: warmth. A soft current of rising heat from decomposing straw, kitchen scraps, and manure, pushed upward in a slow waver. That warmth was subtle, but it was real. It drifted upward even in the freezing air, suggesting the pile had an inner temperature well above the ambient cold. He had once measured a compost mound at over 100 degrees in midwinter. If he could spread that heat across the field, if he could harness it quickly, it might create a barrier that slowed the cold's advance. Maybe not a full shield, but perhaps enough to protect the upper rows until dawn provided natural relief. The idea felt reckless. Compost heat dissipated fast in open air. Moving the pile took effort, and time was running out. Greer would dismiss the notion instantly. Others would call it foolish. Yet frontier survival rarely came from conventional thinking. It came from reading the land, understanding what it offered, and trusting instinct when logic hesitated. Isaac stepped toward the barnyard, his mind racing through possibilities. He needed a strategy that used rising warmth, redirected air, and acted quickly. The compost offered one advantage. It produced heat constantly, not in bursts. If he could move even part of that warmth into the swale, into the cold's pathway, he could disrupt the frost long enough to save the core of the field. The pale dawn brightened slightly behind him. The temperature felt as if it had dropped another degree.
Isaac stared at the barely visible waves rising from the compost pile. That rising warmth gave him a risky idea, one that could save the crop or ruin what remained.
Every frontier solution began with understanding heat, how to make it, trap it, and move it. Isaac now saw that the land offered him a weapon against the frost, but using it demanded speed, judgment, and the discipline he had earned through bitter seasons. Heat meant life on the prairie, and even the smallest amount could shift the balance. If he acted correctly, the cold creeping into his field might yet be turned back. Isaac reached the compost pile at the edge of the barnyard, its dark mass rising almost 3 feet high. The crisp morning air stung his skin, but when he plunged a pitchfork into the center of the heap, a wave of warmth rolled out like breath from a hidden furnace. Steam drifted faintly from the disturbed layers. He knelt and pushed his hand into the opened pocket, feeling the heat build the deeper he reached. It was nearly too hot to touch, a dense, living warmth humming against his palm. Frontier farmers had long known that compost carried heat, but few bothered to understand why. Indigenous gardeners had explained the principle generations earlier. Tiny organisms feeding on plant matter generated their own fire, a slow and steady burn fueled not by flame but by decay. Settlers adopted the practice for warming seedbeds, keeping root vegetables alive, and even thawing soil during stubborn springs. Isaac had measured this pile just last week, and now it felt even hotter. The temperature had likely climbed near 140 degrees, a level only the most active compost achieved. In a morning as bitter as this, that heat felt almost miraculous. He worked quickly, using his shovel to carve out chunks of the compost and mound them into heavy, rounded piles. The material steamed with every turn. He had no time to create perfect shapes. He needed mass and surface area more than symmetry. Each mound had to be large enough to hold heat, but loose enough to release steam into the air. He dragged the first load to the upwind edge of the field, planting it firmly several feet ahead of the nearest corn row. Then he returned for more, repeating the process until 6 thick mounds rose like dark sentinels against the pale frost. The wind carried a faint warmth from them, barely noticeable unless one focused on the subtle waver in the air. Isaac paused long enough to confirm what he already suspected. Steam drifted upward in thin, ghostly ribbons. It was not enough on its own, but combined with positioning and airflow, it could create a barrier, a small upward current that interrupted the cold's downward flow. On the prairie, even a mild rise of warm air could prevent dew from settling, and if dew never formed, frost could not bind as deeply. The placement mattered more than the amount. Isaac's second step required reading the wind with the same precision he used when tracking storms. He walked several yards away from the mounds, watching how the breeze tugged at his coat, sensing its direction by how it slipped across his cheek. The north wind continued its steady push, but the angle had shifted slightly since dawn. Now it carried a faint western curl. That meant he needed to place the mounds not directly upwind, but slightly northwest of the main crop line. If the warm drift reached the plants at the wrong angle, it would miss the rows entirely. He adjusted the mounds accordingly, dragging and reshaping them with practiced strength. Each move consumed precious minutes, but accuracy mattered more than speed. On a morning like this, a misjudged placement could mean losing another half-acre before the sun even rose above the cottonwoods.
When the mounds were positioned, Isaac began thinning the outer layers. This was the third step, one that required careful handling. Too thick, and the heat would stay trapped inside the mounds, unable to rise where it could do any good. Too thin, and the compost would cool too quickly, turning inert before it helped the field. He spread the material with his shovel until a soft vapor blossomed upward. It curled into the air like breath in winter, merging with the cold breeze and drifting toward the waiting corn rows. He checked the spread by holding a damp cloth at shoulder height, watching for any hint of warmth as the wind passed over it. The cloth softened slightly in his hand, losing its stiff chill. That meant the drift was reaching the height he needed. It was only a marginal increase, maybe a few degrees at most, but on a morning frozen at 26, even a tiny shift could keep dew from crystallizing. The method had no guarantee, but it gave the plants a chance they otherwise lacked. A safety habit pulled at the edge of his thoughts, one shaped by years of work with fires and embers. He turned and checked the dryness of the outer straw in the pile. Over-dry compost, especially mixed with old hay, could smolder if piled too tightly. Frontier families had learned that lesson the hard way. Isaac scattered a few handfuls of fresh moisture from a nearby bucket along the driest section to keep the risk low. The heat he needed was microbial, not flame-driven, and the last thing he could risk was a spark drifting into a wind this brisk. The mounds were stable, damp enough to release steam safely, and warm enough to generate the upward draft he depended upon. He stepped back to observe the system as a whole. The compost's internal heat created vertical movement. That steam prevented dew formation. The lack of dew slowed frost expansion. It was a fragile chain of benefits, but frontier survival often depended on fragile chains. Isaac's breath rose along with the steam, merging briefly before the wind stretched both into thin bands that floated toward the corn. For the first time since stepping outside, he felt a thread of hope. The frost line near the upper rows seemed to hesitate, no longer advancing with the same relentless speed. The cold had not been stopped, but its progress had been slowed. That was all he needed, time, even a little of it, until the sun took over. Then the wind shifted again. A low, sudden gust rushed from the west, stronger and sharper than anything earlier. It curled under the steam and pushed it sideways. Isaac stiffened as the warm drift scattered, thinning into the air before it reached the plants. The gust rolled across the field once more, threatening to sweep the steaming mounds away from the crops entirely. Wind decided everything on the plains. Too weak, and the cold settled like a blanket over every living thing. Too strong, and warmth vanished before it reached a single leaf. Isaac now stood inside a narrow corridor where both forces collided, and whatever happened in the next hour would determine the fate of his fields. The sky stayed dark, the wind unpredictable, and the frost marched forward as if driven by purpose. Isaac stepped back toward the first row of corn and watched the line of frost creeping across the ground. Even without bending down to touch it, he could see the progression. Slow, steady, relentless. On mornings like this, frost behaved like a living current, spreading at a rate of 2 to 3 feet per minute when the terrain allowed it. The shallow swale created the perfect channel, funneling cold air in a low, invisible river that spilled into his main crop. He needed to interrupt that river with a warmer current, something that rose fast enough to counter the cold's downward slide. The compost mounds continued to produce steam, but the gust from the west had pushed the warmth off course. Instead of drifting into the frost's pathway, it thinned and dissipated, losing its strength before reaching the threatened plants. Isaac clenched his jaw. He needed structure, something that shaped the warm drift, narrowing it the way a chimney controlled smoke. If he could guide the steam into a defined line, he might still slow the frost long enough for dawn's natural heat to take over. He moved quickly to the barn, pulling free 2 long boards weathered from years of sun and storms. The edges were splintered, but the planks were straight enough to act as guides. Dragging them back to the compost mounds, he planted each board just downwind, angling them so that the steam curling upward would strike the boards and redirect along the correct path. It was makeshift engineering, but frontier families worked with what they had, shaping solutions from instinct and available materials rather than waiting for perfect tools. When he pushed the boards into the soil, the steam struck their surfaces and veered sideways, creating a narrow channel of warmth that drifted directly toward the corn rows. Isaac exhaled, watching the new current form. In the faint moonlight, the redirected steam rose in soft, wavering lines, almost like fog trails. He stepped along the channel's edge, gauging its height, the softness of its movement, and how the air felt when it brushed against his skin. The warmth was minimal but present, enough to hold dew at bay if it reached the leaves intact. He tested the drift again by holding a damp cloth above the compost mounds. The fabric relaxed slightly in his grip, losing its stiff chill. That meant the steam was rising at the correct height. Frontier survival often required this kind of improvisation, treating warmth as a resource that flowed like water and needed direction to be useful. Behind him, footsteps crunched across the frosted ground. Thomas Greer appeared again, arms crossed, his breath fogging in steady bursts. He eyed the compost mounds, the rising steam, and the angled boards with a look hovering between disbelief and amusement. Greer lived by Eastern farming logic, the traditional practices his family had used back in the wooded country of Pennsylvania. Those methods depended on sheltering trees, stable winds, and slower temperature shifts. Out here, where the land lay open and wind carved patterns in the soil, those rules often failed. Greer shook his head and muttered, not in quoted dialogue, but with the familiar tone Isaac had heard many times, something about chasing illusions and trusting heat that couldn't be felt from 10 steps away. Isaac didn't bother to answer. Argument stole time. Frost stole more. What he needed was to strengthen the fog lines he'd created and extend them across the swale, giving the frost more obstacles before it reached the central rows.
He lifted his shovel and returned to the compost pile, drawing out another load. Each chunk of steaming material felt heavier than before, dense with trapped warmth. He built 3 smaller mounds, spacing them between the larger ones, creating a staggered line that thickened the flow of warm air. Once positioned, he adjusted the boards again, moving them several inches to ensure the steam collected efficiently before drifting toward the crops. He examined the lines from multiple angles, crouching low, then standing tall, watching how the steam curled under the slight shift of wind. Near the edges of the mounds, the air thickened with moisture. Isaac stayed cautious, avoiding the densest pockets of vapor. Heavy compost steam could irritate the lungs, especially when inhaled too quickly. He kept his breathing shallow while working close to the heat, a small but necessary precaution on a morning where every decision carried risk. Above the field, the moon sank slightly, illuminating the drifting steam with a soft glow. The vapor formed a faint halo suspended between earth and sky, a shimmering line of warmth against a landscape locked in cold. For a moment, the field looked almost otherworldly, frost gleaming like crushed glass, steam lines weaving through the rows, boards standing like lonely guardians of fragile heat. Isaac took the moment in, allowing a thin thread of hope to settle through his thoughts. The steam was reaching the corn. The dew on the upper leaves had stopped thickening. The frost seemed to hesitate, its pace disrupted by the rising warmth. But the cold had its own strength. The prairie night deepened as the last trace of moonlight softened behind distant clouds, and with that deepening came a bite sharper than before. Isaac felt the shift instantly, not as a gust, but as a tightening of the air. He paused, looking toward the open horizon. The temperature had dropped again, maybe 2 full degrees. He didn't need a thermometer to know it. The cold pressed differently now, heavier and more direct, the kind that caused breath to crystallize faster and soil hardness to spread deeper. He hurried along the rows, tracking the frost line with narrowed eyes. The creeping edge, which had slowed earlier, now gained speed, moving faster, tightening its grip on the low ground. It advanced at a pace beyond the earlier 2 or 3 feet per minute, surging through the swale toward the central stand. Isaac felt his pulse quicken. The warmth he'd harnessed still worked, but the cold now pressed harder, forcing the frost forward with renewed intensity. The rising steam flickered as the stronger cold pushed down, threatening to mute its effect. Isaac knew what that meant. The frost had entered its most aggressive phase, and he had even less time than he believed. The sky remained dark, the horizon still unlit by dawn. He needed another strategy layered atop the fog lines, something that amplified warmth or redirected the cold more forcefully. His mounds, boards, and steam corridors held the frost at bay for a moment, but that moment was shrinking. The temperature continued falling, the frost gained speed, and the prairie warned him in its quiet, unforgiving way. If he didn't act again immediately, the field would be lost. The frost had become a living force, crawling across the land with a speed that challenged every rule Isaac understood. Compost heat alone would not hold it back. The cold was too deep, too aggressive, too anchored in the swale funneling through his field. He needed a second line of defense, one he had learned from older homesteaders who had battled freak freezes long before he arrived on the Dakota plains. On nights like this, they said, smoke could become a shield. Isaac moved toward the barnyard storage shed, boots crunching through the thin layer of ice forming atop the soil.
He could hear the faint hiss of frost settling deeper into the ground, the sound almost like grain falling against a wooden bin. That sound alone pushed him to work faster. Inside the shed, he kept a stack of old metal pans and shallow buckets, each one dented from years of heavy use. These would serve as smudge pots. He grabbed 6 of them, setting them in a row near the barn door, and reached for a bundle of straw stored beneath a tarp. The straw was slightly damp from last week's rain, the perfect consistency for slow ignition. Smudge fires needed moisture to smolder, not burn, and damp straw created dense smoke without erupting into open flame. He filled each pan halfway, packing the straw just tight enough that it would hold shape when lit. Too loose, and it burned too fast. Too tight, and it would suffocate instantly. Old homesteaders had taught him that the secret lay in texture, a balance between air and resistance. When he finished filling the pans, he carried them to the upwind edge of the field, spacing them roughly 15 to 20 feet apart. The placement had to be deliberate. If the smudge pots sat too close together, the smoke would pool thick enough to choke the plants. If he spaced them too far apart, the gaps between smoke lines would allow radiant heat to escape upward, giving frost a clear path to the leaf surfaces. Isaac crouched beside the first pot and pulled a small ember from the glowing remains of his cabin's overnight fire. He nestled it beneath the top layer of straw, letting it press into the faint damp fibers until a faintest thread of smoke rose from the bundle. The key was to ignite slowly, encouraging a smolder rather than a flame. Flames rose too fast and consumed fuel without producing the dense smoke needed to trap heat. The ember glowed brighter as it worked its way inside, the smoke thickening with each passing second. Isaac repeated the process for the next 5 pans, coaxing each to life with the same careful technique. Soon, thin ribbons of gray smoke curled upward, carried by the wind and drifting toward the rows just behind the compost mounds. Smoke interacted with cold in ways many did not understand. It trapped warmth close to the ground by preventing radiant cooling, forming an insulating layer between the plants and the open sky. Homesteaders once estimated that a properly maintained smoke line could reduce radiant heat loss by nearly 30%, enough to prevent frost crystals from forming on the uppermost leaves. Isaac did not depend on numbers alone, but he understood the principle. When warm air from the compost rose and collided with the smoke drifting across the field, the mixture created a thicker shield of protection, a temporary barrier buying him minutes he desperately needed. He moved from pot to pot, monitoring the drift direction. The wind still carried a faint western push, and he watched how the smoke clung to the ground before rising. It swirled low among the cornstalks, forming a thin haze that blurred the lower edges of the rows. The scene felt eerily beautiful under the fading moon, steam lines rising like ghostly ropes, smoke rolling in soft sheets, frost shimmering on every untouched surface. Yet beneath that quiet beauty lay the tension of a race against nature. Isaac knew too little smoke would make all this effort meaningless, letting the frost slip through the cracks. Too much, however, could clog the plant's stomata, choking the crops instead of saving them. Frontier strategies often walked that fine line, one misstep away from failure. As the first smoke line thickened, Isaac stepped back several yards to assess the field as a single system. Compost warmth created vertical lift, smudge smoke blocked upward heat loss, and the angled boards helped guide that warmth toward the most vulnerable rows. It was a layered defense, not one single trick, and he felt a cautious spark of confidence knowing he had implemented each piece with precision. Yet the frost still advanced. He saw it reach the first row of beans, a delicate white crackle forming along the base of the leaves. The sound carried faintly in the wind, almost like paper stiffening in a draft. Isaac's pulse jumped. That crackling meant the frost had entered the point of no return for the lowest rows. If he didn't find a way to slow it down further, the cold would soon overwhelm the entire system he had built.
The sky remained dark, showing no sign of early dawn. He knew he still had at least 30 minutes before even the faintest warming would begin. The frost at the edge of the field continued to creep, shining in the moon's reflection like a blade drawn across the land. He walked along the smoke pots, adjusting their placement so the wind carried the haze more evenly. One pot he shifted 3 feet forward, another he lifted and set onto a slight rise to prevent the smoke from pooling too deeply. Every adjustment mattered. Every second lost meant colder air settling into the swale. He paused for a moment, listening again to the land. The frost's crackle grew louder, the advancing front moving with a slow, unforgiving rhythm. Isaac knelt and pressed his palm against the soil just beyond the frost line. The surface felt hard, brittle. The cold beneath it crept into the earth with a determination that felt almost sentient. This was the moment old homesteaders had warned about, the moment when frost gained momentum, and ignoring it meant surrendering entire acres. Isaac stood and scanned the rows, noticing how the smoke lifted slightly near the center, but hugged the ground on the edges. That imbalance had to be corrected, or the frost would funnel through the thinner side. He grabbed another pan, filling it quickly with straw and setting it at the weakest point in the smoke line. When he ignited it, the new stream of smoke filled the gap, evening out the barrier. But the cold refused to yield. It crawled onward, pressing against the steam and smoke like an unstoppable tide. Isaac stepped back toward the first row of corn, listening intently to the strange, sharp sounds carried across the field. A new noise emerged, distinct from the crackle of frost on leaves. It came from the soil, deep and sudden, like something snapping beneath the surface. He froze in place. A sharp crack echoed through the still air. Something in the ground had changed. Frost did not only strike from above, it attacked from below with a force far more destructive than surface ice. As the soil temperature slipped toward freezing, hidden dangers emerged beneath the field, dangers capable of undoing every layer of defense Isaac had built. The crack he heard was more than a sound, it was a warning from the earth itself. On the frontier, such warnings were never ignored. Isaac knelt at the edge of the swale, pushing aside the thin crust of frost to reveal the soil beneath. In the moonlight, he saw the first signs of contraction cracks, thin fissures slicing through the top layer of earth like hairline fractures on old pottery. These cracks formed when the soil cooled too quickly, shrinking and pulling apart. Once open, they acted like cold funnels, guiding frigid air directly into the root zone. That underground chill was often the true killer of crops, capable of destroying plants even if their leaves survived the night. He brushed a fingertip across the widening fissure. Cold radiated upward in a steady, merciless stream. If the cracks deepened, the compost heat and smoke layers would not matter. The frost would invade from below, freezing the roots solid. Isaac had heard indigenous gardeners describe similar dangers in low-lying planting grounds, especially near creek beds. They dug subtle trenches to divert cold air, shaping the land so the chill drained into safe zones rather than pooling beneath their crops. Settlers rarely understood this method, but Isaac remembered the lessons carefully, especially now as the frost gained speed. He rose and grabbed his shovel, planting the blade firmly into the hardening soil. The ground resisted, stiffened by freezing temperatures, but Isaac used his weight to drive the shovel deeper. He needed a trench, something 8 to 10 inches deep, running along the length of the swale. A trench would capture the sinking cold, giving it a path to follow instead of allowing it to spread into the roots. He measured the depth with the handle, adjusting until he reached the right range. The work strained his arms, but he refused to slow down. Every minute mattered. Angling the trench walls was the next critical step. If the sides stood straight, the cold might stagnate, but if he sloped the edges gradually, the chilled air could flow downward like water. He carved the trench accordingly, pushing soil outward in a gentle fan that widened the path. As he shaped the trench, the frost crust crackled beneath the shifting soil, a reminder of the invisible threat creeping across the field. He paused only once to wipe the moisture from his gloves, his breath drifting in pale ribbons against the dark sky. Testing the trench required the simple grass strip technique. Isaac tore a thin strip of dried grass and dropped it into the deepest part of the trench. The strip settled smoothly, drifting down as if carried on a faint current. That tiny movement confirmed what he needed to know. Cold air was already sliding into the newly dug passage, following the channel instead of spreading across the field. The method had worked for centuries among indigenous farmers who shaped small ground features to protect their crops from early frosts. Now it worked for him.
He returned to the field's edge and checked the plants near the trench line. The soil still felt dangerously cold, but the downward pull of air prevented the worst of the freeze from reaching the roots. Isaac worked quickly to cover exposed roots along the nearest rows, packing loosened soil over vulnerable areas to insulate them. This step felt slow compared to the frantic rush of earlier tasks, yet it was essential. Bare roots attracted frost like metal attracted heat. He scooped handfuls of soil from the trench's removed pile, pressing it gently around the base of each plant. The corn leaves trembled in the wind, stiff but still alive. That was enough to keep going. As he worked, he noticed something strange happening in the air above the field. The steam from the compost mounds drifted upward in soft, wavering lines. The smoke from the smudge pots rolled in lower, thicker curls. But now, instead of layering separately, the two currents began to merge. The mixing created swirling eddies of gray vapor that twisted unpredictably in the shifting breeze. Isaac watched the air carefully. The behavior of steam and smoke revealed more about wind changes than any flag or vane. Something in the atmosphere was shifting again, though he could not yet tell whether it would help or hinder his work. He moved along the trench one more time, checking the depth, the angle, and the airflow. The grass test showed the downward pull remained steady. As long as the trench held, the cold would not flood the root zone. But above ground, the frost continued to glitter across the surface, marching toward the compost line. Dawn still had not arrived. The temperature hung dangerously low, hugging the ground like a second skin. Isaac felt that familiar frontier pressure, the sense that the land judged every action, offering no forgiveness for errors. The swirling mixture of steam and smoke grew thicker, almost luminous under the dim moonlight. The shapes shifted with an uneasiness Isaac could not explain. He had relied on compost heat, smoke barriers, and trench systems layered together in a desperate bid to delay the frost. Yet the cold still pushed forward, slipping between the defenses with unsettling persistence. Isaac wiped his forehead, feeling the sting of chilled sweat. He stared at the horizon, searching for the faintest sign of dawn. None appeared. Then he heard footsteps again. Heavy, deliberate, crunching through the frost with a tension that felt different from earlier. When Isaac turned, Thomas Greer approached from the far side of the field, his face hardened in the dim light. The earlier skepticism had vanished. In its place came something sharper, anger mixed with a strange sense of conviction. Greer stopped near the trench, his breath forming thick clouds. He glanced at the mounds, the boards, the smoke, the steaming compost, and finally the trench carved through the swale. Without speaking, he let out a low, bitter sound that echoed more like an accusation than surprise. His expression carried the weight of a belief that Isaac's work interfered with forces better left untouched. Greer's gaze fixed on the swirling steam, the altered air currents, and the trembling plants caught in the shifting haze. The cold deepened. The field waited, and Greer's anger rose with it, blaming Isaac for interfering with what he called the natural order.
Conflict on the frontier rarely erupted into blows. It simmered instead in the narrow space between pride and experience. Isaac had no time for argument. The frost was seconds from reaching the heart of his field, and every breath of cold air pushed another inch of danger toward the crops that fed his family. The night tightened around him, demanding focus, not debate. Greer stood several yards away, breath rising in thick clouds as he glared across the rows. His anger still simmered, but Isaac barely registered it. He had no spare energy for explanations or confrontations. Everything he had done, steam lines, smoke lines, trenches, worked only in layers. If any failed for even a moment, the frost would surge through. He watched the shimmering edge of ice creep toward the center rows and knew he needed one last defense, something fast, something that could buy precious minutes until dawn. The land had offered him a final clue earlier, though he hadn't recognized it at the time. Heat stored inside the cabin. He turned sharply and ran toward the cabin door, boots jolting against the stiff ground. Greer called something after him, his tone shifting from anger to confusion, but Isaac didn't break stride. Inside, the lingering warmth wrapped around him.
The stove still held red embers beneath the iron plates, and beside it sat the wash basin half filled with used water from the night before. It wasn't hot, but it was warm enough to be of use. Frontier families sometimes relied on a thin ice glaze to protect crops during sudden cold spells. The technique seemed counterintuitive, yet it worked because water released heat as it froze. That thin layer, only millimeters thick, could protect plant tissue just long enough to keep it alive. Isaac needed every method he had ever learned, even those rarely used. He grabbed the basin, poured it into an iron pot, and placed it directly on the stove plates. The heat pulsed upward, warming the water as quickly as the metal could carry it. His children slept in the back room, unaware of the silent war unfolding outside. He added another pot, filling it from the rain barrel by the door. Each second mattered. He watched the surface shimmer, gauging its temperature by how quickly his breath dispersed above it. When the water warmed enough to release faint mist, he lifted the pot carefully and poured it into 2 waiting buckets. The metal handles burned against his gloves, and the water sloshed dangerously close to freezing again, but warm was enough for the method to work. He carried both buckets out the door, the wind slicing across his face like a blade of glass. Greer stared at him with a mix of disbelief and unease, his earlier anger folding into the edges of worry. He had seen the frost spreading too. Pride could argue with technique, but it couldn't argue with the sight of plants dying inch by inch. Isaac reached the critical rows, those standing directly in the path of the frost river funneling through the swale. He knelt, dipped his hand into the first bucket, and splashed a light spray over the nearest leaves. The water struck the chilled air and immediately began to thicken. It clung to each leaf, sliding downward before freezing into a thin, transparent crust. The process looked fragile, almost delicate, yet he knew from old homesteaders that this protective glaze could buy 10 to 12 minutes of survival. Those minutes could mean the difference between ruin and harvest. He worked quickly, splashing the leaves with practiced efficiency. Too much water would weigh the plants down and cause collapse. Too little would freeze too quickly to offer protection. He found the balance by watching how the droplets formed, how the sheen spread evenly along the leaf edges. Frost glittered beneath his hands, creeping forward in sharp crystals. He splashed another row, then another, using both buckets until only thin trails of warmth remained. The protective ice layers caught the moonlight, glowing faintly as if the leaves themselves held trapped light.
Behind him, Greer exhaled sharply. Not disbelief this time, something closer to concern. He stepped closer, his boots crunching loudly in the brittle soil. For the first time that night, Greer seemed to see the frost not as a force of nature to be accepted, but as something actively trying to consume the field. His silence stretched long, punctuated only by the distant hiss of frost tightening its grip on the lower rows. Isaac returned to the cabin for another round of water, warming it faster this time by pushing the pot deeper under the stoveplate. When he came back out, Greer surprised him by grabbing the second bucket without a word. Isaac did not speak either. There was no time for acknowledgement. They moved down the rows together, each working the glaze technique across the plants most at risk. The cold bit harder against their hands and faces, but neither slowed. The frost line approached the compost mounds again, the advancing crystals glittering sharply like broken glass scattered across the swale. Isaac listened to the field, an instinct he had honed through years of observing how wind shifted through grass and how soil responded to the smallest temperature changes. The trench still pulled cold downward. The smoke barriers drifted in slow sheets. The steam line still pulsed upward, carrying warmth in faint threads. And now the ice glaze formed its own shield, reflecting the moonlight with a hard, cold beauty. For a moment, the frost's advance hesitated. The protective layers worked together, catching the cold at multiple points. Isaac could feel the tension in the air loosen slightly, though he resisted the urge to hope too fully. These methods bought time, not victory. He checked the horizon again. Still dark. No sign of the first faint line of dawn that would warm the field naturally. He glanced back at the crop, monitoring the sheen across each leaf. The ice held firm. As long as it remained stable, the plants beneath were protected. He stepped into the swale, felt the cold spiral downward into the trench, and knew the flow was still moving as intended. The field stood on a fragile edge of survival. But it stood. Then the wind, which had been shifting unpredictably for hours, dropped into absolute stillness. No movement in the smoke. No movement in the steam, no movement in the frost-laden air. Everything froze in place, as if the prairie held its breath. Isaac felt the stillness settle over the land, a final test of every defense he had built. Stillness on a frost night was the most dangerous sign the plains could offer. Without wind to buffet the air, cold sank straight into the soil like water dropping into a well, collecting in every hollow and stealing heat from the ground itself. Isaac felt that stillness settle over the field with a weight that tightened the night around him. If the temperature plunged again, all his defenses, steam, smoke, trenches, ice glaze, would be tested in their most fragile moment. He lifted his eyes toward the sky, searching for signs that only experienced frontiersmen ever learned to read. A faint halo circled the moon, not bright but unmistakable, glowing like a thin ring of ice suspended far above the prairie. Such halos meant moisture freezing in high clouds, often signaling another drop in temperature before dawn. Isaac knew this sign well. It had preceded the terrible freeze of '86, the one that killed half a dozen homesteaders' gardens in a single night. Beneath the halo, the stars shone with unnerving clarity, sharp as pinpoints. The sky only looked that clean when the air had drained of warmth. He walked to the edge of his field and knelt beside a frost-covered weed. In the span of moments, delicate crystals thickened across its surface, spreading in branching patterns that grew faster than they should have. Rapid crystal growth always meant the temperature was still falling. The land was preparing to make one final push of cold before sunrise, the kind that could kill even the strongest crops under a protective glaze. Isaac inhaled slowly and watched the cloud of breath form before him. It rose only a few inches before dissolving. Earlier in the night, it had lifted higher. Now, the height shrinking meant the air closer to the ground was colder than before. He needed one more tactic, one more layer of protection, something steady that didn't rely on wind, air currents, or chance. The old homesteaders had spoken of a method rarely used, mostly because it demanded strength, speed, and courage to handle hot material in bitter cold. Heated stones could radiate warmth just enough to lift a thin layer of air from the ground, creating a fragile corridor where frost slowed its advance. Isaac had used this trick once as a boy with his father, protecting only a handful of seedlings beside the cabin. He had never attempted it across an entire field. But tonight, there was no choice. He ran to the fire pit behind the cabin where a few embers still glowed beneath the coals. He shoved aside the remaining wood and found several stones placed there from earlier days of cooking. Stones retained heat better than any metal pan, especially when warmed steadily over coals. Isaac added fresh wood, fanned the embers, and coaxed the fire into a quick surge. The flames rose just enough to heat the stones without cracking them. He turned the rocks with a metal rake, rotating them so every surface absorbed the heat evenly. When he judged their temperature by hovering his gloved hand above them, he felt the familiar, steady warmth, strong but not scorching. They likely held around 110 degrees, a weak heat by daylight standards, but a significant force on a night slipping toward deadly cold. Thick gloves were essential. Isaac grabbed the stones one by one, lifting them with practiced care and setting them into a metal bucket lined with old cloth to keep them from rolling. The heat pressed through the gloves, pulsing with surprising strength. He carried the bucket toward the field, the air crackling faintly as the stones met the critical edge of the corn rows, the point where the frost pressed hardest. He began placing the stones in a line. Each stone sat a few feet apart, forming a low, uneven border. The heat rose from them in faint shimmering waves, barely visible except where moonlight caught the distortion. This corridor became his final defense of the night. He walked back for more stones, repeating the process with precision. Never heat stones in open flame. He reminded himself of that rule with each trip. Direct flame could weaken the rock, making it prone to fracturing when set in cold air. Coals were safer, steadier. He kept the fire at a controlled burn, avoiding any flare-up that might break the stone's surface. When he moved the next batch into position, the heat drifted upward again, mixing with the smoke and steam that still hovered at the edges of the field. He checked the temperature using an old breath cloud method he learned from a visiting Dakota gardener years ago. He released a slow breath and watched the cloud rise. Near the heated stones, it climbed slightly higher than before. It wasn't much,
perhaps 3 inches of lift, but that slight rise told him the air above the stones had warmed enough to create a thin blanket of protection. On a night like this, 3 inches of warmer air could decide the fate of an entire field. Isaac continued lining stones until the corridor stretched across the entire critical row. When he stepped back, he saw the system working as a whole, the steam rising in angled lines from the compost mounds, the smoke drifting in muted, drifting sheets, the trench pulling cold downward, the ice glaze shimmering on the leaves, and now the warm corridor radiating a soft, persistent heat. Every part of the system worked not alone, but together, each piece reinforcing the thin boundary between survival and loss. Greer watched from a distance. The anger that had shaped his earlier words had faded into something else entirely. Concern, perhaps, or awe. The field glowed with dim layers of smoke, steam, frost, and heat, an intricate network of defenses that only someone who respected the land's smallest signals could have built. Greer took a tentative step forward, but didn't approach further. Isaac didn't need conversation. He needed the field to hold. He examined the frost line again. For the first time in an hour, it had stopped advancing. The layer of ice glittered in place, frozen mid-crawl. The heated stones lifted air gently upward, creating a subtle barrier the cold struggled to cross. The plants nearest the stones trembled slightly in the stillness, but did not stiffen further. Isaac watched every detail with the intense focus of a man measuring survival by the inch. The frost did not retreat, but it held still, refusing to advance. The air felt denser now, as if the entire field had fallen into a delicate equilibrium. Nothing moved, not the smoke, not the frost, not the steam. He looked toward the horizon, searching again for the first gray hint of dawn. Nothing. Still blackness, still cold. And he knew too well what that meant. Dawn was still an hour away, and cold was always harshest before sunrise.
The battlefield was set. Warmth lines drawn against cold shadows, steam against frost crystals, heated stones against a night that wanted to erase everything he'd sown. As Isaac waited for the first trace of light, every technique he had deployed worked together like a fragile, hand-built machine. The field felt alive in its stillness, balanced on the edge of catastrophe, and the next hour would reveal whether his defenses could endure until dawn. Isaac stood in the center of the field, breath shallow, body trembling from exhaustion and cold. Around him, the layers of protection pulsed faintly like parts of an improvised engine. The compost mounds continued releasing thin plumes of steam, rising in wavering lines before merging with the still air. The smoke pots released drifting sheets of gray haze that curled low, blocking the frost from reaching the upper leaves. The trench carved through the swale guided cold air downward, capturing the chill before it could spill across the root zone. And the line of heated stones radiated their weak but steady warmth, creating a subtle lift in the air along the field's most vulnerable section. Each part did just enough. None of them could have worked alone. The frost line remained painfully close, only a few feet from the central stand of corn. For a long moment it did not move. Isaac watched it with such intensity that his eyes burned. He had battled frost before, but never a strike this aggressive or swift, never one that demanded so many layered methods to counter its advance. Beneath the dim sky, the frost crystals shone like interlocking shards of glass, forming a boundary that seemed ready to surge again at the slightest shift. Then, almost imperceptibly, a breeze touched the field. Isaac felt the faintest stroke of moving air brush across his cheek. It was weak, barely enough to ripple the smoke, yet it was movement, and movement meant change. The smoke line stirred, curling gently. The steam lifted higher, forming slender ribbons. The frost crystals quivered as the cold lost its perfect stillness. Isaac held his breath as the breeze lingered, fragile but real. The prairie was waking. Even this small stir of wind hinted that the night's grip was loosening. The frost line shivered. Then, slowly, almost reluctantly, it began to ease backward. Isaac exhaled, though the breath came out more like a collapse than a relief. His legs wobbled beneath him, drained by hours of non-stop labor in the bitter cold.
He crouched, placing a hand on the ground to steady himself. The soil still felt icy, but no longer worsening. The trench continued to pull the densest cold downward. The steam corridors reasserted their upward currents, and along the stone line, the air rose smoothly, creating a soft boundary that forced the frost into retreat. The field had survived another minute. It needed dozens more. Greer approached quietly from behind. No anger in his steps now, only a tentative caution. The silence between them had shifted from tension to something different. Mutual recognition of the danger they faced. Without speaking, Greer reached down and helped Isaac steady himself. His hand was rough and cold, but the gesture carried weight. The pride that once fueled his frustration had been humbled by the raw reality of the frost's power. Greer had witnessed what Isaac's methods accomplished, not tricks, not interference, but survival. Isaac nodded once, accepting the help without breaking his focus on the field. Greer didn't leave his side. Instead, he quietly moved to adjust one of the smoke pots that had tilted slightly. He set it upright, added a bit more straw from a nearby bundle, and returned to stand beside Isaac. The simple act symbolized more than cooperation. It signaled a shift in respect, a realization that frontier life demanded openness to knowledge from many sources, not just those born from tradition back east. The breeze grew stronger, carrying the faint scent of warming air from the east. The frost continued to pull back in slow waves, as though resisting until the last possible moment. Isaac listened for the subtle changes, the crackle growing softer, the ice crystals losing their sharp edges, the tension in the soil easing as temperature stabilized. His breath cloud rose higher now, drifting nearly a foot before dissolving. That alone told him the air had warmed by a couple of degrees. Then the horizon shifted.
A thin silver line appeared to the east, barely visible, but unmistakable. Dawn approached with excruciating slowness, the sky transitioning from inky black to a muted charcoal gray. With that faint light came the first measurable rise in temperature. Isaac could feel it in the way his breath lingered longer, in how the frost crystals near his boots softened at their tips. Sunrise on such a night often raised temperatures by 3 or 4 degrees within minutes. Those few degrees meant everything. The sun's earliest rays reached the tops of the cottonwoods in the distance, igniting them with a pale, trembling glow. The field held steady as the light advanced. When the first beam touched the icy rose, the frost glittered like polished metal. Ice crystals melted in slow rivulets, sliding off leaves and pooling into droplets that clung to the plant's surfaces. The water shimmered, reflecting the pale dawn like scattered stars across the field. Isaac almost collapsed again, not from weakness this time, but from the sudden flood of relief washing through him. He leaned forward, hands on his knees, watching the frost melt from the edges inward. The protective ice glaze he had applied the previous hour softened into beads that dripped harmlessly to the soil. The steam rose higher as the warming air lifted it naturally, helping to chase away the lingering cold pockets. Even the stones released their last waves of heat before cooling, their job nearly finished. Greer exhaled slowly beside him. Not a word passed between them. They didn't need them. The field itself spoke, in the slow surrender of frost, in the damp shimmer left behind, in the quiet dawn of a field that had endured an attack far beyond anything the almanacs would have predicted. Isaac walked forward once the frost line had fully retreated, stepping carefully among the recovering rows. The leaves trembled in the light breeze, some curled, some bruised by the cold, but many still alive. The resilience pulled at him more deeply than triumph. He reached out, touching a leaf that still held warmth from the heated stones. It flexed easily, not brittle. It lived. Then he looked further down the row, and what he saw tightened his chest. In the early light, the damage he hadn't noticed during the panic of the night revealed itself. Entire stretches of lower plants stood coated in brittle white, beyond saving. Some roots had suffered frostbite despite the trench. Sections of the bean rows lay flattened, their leaves too stiff to recover. And in that first full view of the field, he understood exactly how close he had come to losing everything. Survival on the frontier was never only about saving crops. It was about learning the rhythms of wind, soil, sky, and shadow, reading signals that city men might walk past without a second glance. Isaac knew that what mattered just as much as endurance was passing those lessons down, so the next person facing a deadly frost wouldn't repeat the same mistakes. The prairie taught with a hard hand, but it always left a trace of wisdom behind. Isaac stepped slowly through the rows, the soft crunch of thawing frost beneath his boots echoing in the growing quiet of dawn. Steam lifted off the field in thin, ghost-like strands, hovering above the warming soil. The first real sunlight washed over the corn, revealing the full measure of the night's assault. Nearly half the field lay in varying stages of damage. Some leaves curled permanently inward, others stiffened beyond recovery. But the central rows, the most crucial section, still stood with enough life to carry his family through the coming winter. Survival rarely meant perfection. It meant preserving what mattered most. He moved between the rows, evaluating each plant with hands still trembling from cold and exhaustion. The worst losses came from the lowest ground, where the frost river had pushed hardest before the trench turned it away. Those plants lay bent and defeated, white as chalk. The bean rows fared better in patches, especially where the smoke had drifted thickest. Near the stone corridor, the corn leaves had regained their color, the ice glaze dripping away in slow beads that sparkled against the sunlight. Isaac touched one leaf gently, feeling the suppleness returned beneath its surface. It was alive, and for the moment, that was enough. Greer lingered near the edge of the field, his hat in his hands, eyes lowered in a way Isaac had never seen before. The bravado he wore so easily in other seasons had dissolved during the long night. As Isaac approached, Greer swallowed hard, his breath stirring the thin mist rising from the soil. He didn't look up right away, as if searching for the right words inside the churn of guilt and gratitude. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the earlier sharpness. Not a direct apology, but a quiet acknowledgement shaped by hard lessons, the kind the prairie demanded. Isaac accepted it without ceremony. Out here, humility didn't need speeches, it needed understanding. Greer had misjudged the land, underestimated the frost, and dismissed Isaac's methods. Yet he had also helped when it mattered, stepping forward in the critical hours when stubborn pride gave way to necessity. That counted more than any apology. Isaac glanced back across the field, replaying each technique that had formed the night's fragile defense. The compost mounds had offered the first rise of warmth, releasing steam that drifted into the cold's path. The smoke lines from the smudge pots had trapped heat and blocked the sky's radiative pull, slowing the frost's approach. The ice shield formed by warm water bought precious minutes when the frost was strongest. And finally, the warmed stones created a corridor of gentle heat that held the cold at bay until the first break of dawn. Individually, each method would have failed. Together, they had woven a net strong enough to catch the worst of the freeze. Isaac walked the length of the trench, checking the soil. It felt pliable again, not brittle. He examined the compost mounds, still warm at their cores, and the stones, now cool to the touch, had served their purpose with quiet resilience. These techniques weren't tricks, they were survival strategies shaped from generations of trial, error, and borrowed knowledge. He knew he needed to turn these trials into clear, teachable rules, not only for himself, but for anyone who might face the same fate in years to come. The land changed without warning. Frost that arrived 6 weeks early once could arrive 8 weeks early the next time. Isaac paused at the center of the field and formed the doctrine in his mind, the frontier distilled into 7 simple principles. 1. Read the land before reading the calendar. Dates published back east meant little on the Dakota plains. Signs in the wind, soil, and sky offered truth long before any almanac. 2. Heat must rise in lines, not pools. Compost warmth, smoke drift, and warm stones all worked best when guided by boards, wind, or terrain. 3. Redirect cold before fighting it.
A trench 8 to 10 inches deep could change the entire flow of a frost river. 4. Ice can protect life. A thin glaze of frozen water could buy 10 to 12 minutes, sometimes the difference between death and recovery. 5. Warmth without structure is wasted. Stones, compost, and smoke needed placement, angles, and balance to build a layered defense. 6. Observe constantly. Breath cloud height, frost crystal growth, and moon halos offered silent warnings long before cold reached the field. And 7. Never rely on a single method. Survival came from systems, not isolated tactics.
Isaac knew these principles had roots deeper than his own memory. Indigenous families had shaped frost defenses long before settlers arrived, teaching the subtleties of cold air sinks, ground signs, and the behaviors of frost in stillness. Scandinavian immigrants brought the practice of heated stones and controlled smoke. Homesteaders blended these techniques into hybrid methods tested by harsh seasons. What Isaac had done tonight was not invention, it was inheritance, shaped into action. He stepped farther down the row, the light strengthening around him. The field steamed gently in the growing warmth, thin tendrils rising like signals of recovery. Birds began stirring along the fence line, shaking frost from their wings. A distant coyote called once, its voice drifting across the prairie with the calm acceptance of morning. The plants closest to the compost line straightened slightly, their leaves bearing the marks of the night but still holding their color. It would take days to know exactly how many would survive, but the signs pointed toward hope rather than despair. Greer approached again, walking slowly along the edge of the field. He glanced at the damaged rows, then at the surviving ones, marveling at the pattern of endurance shaped by Isaac's midnight work. His respect came quietly, carried in soft gestures and a changed posture. Isaac offered him a nod, a simple acknowledgement that the land had taught them both. As the sun lifted higher, casting long shadows across the damp earth, Isaac breathed more freely. The frost had retreated, the plants had endured. His family would have enough to last the winter. The night had taken its price in exhaustion and lost crops, but it had given something back, a deeper understanding of the land's logic. He stood at the top of the field as dawn's full light washed over the recovering rows. Steam drifted upward in pale ribbons. The earth breathed again, warm enough to soften the longest shadows. But Isaac knew the prairie never rested. Its dangers came in seasons, each one carrying its own trials. Frost had been the threat this time. The next season would bring something far more unpredictable. The frost night became a testament to Isaac's will and the layered wisdom of the frontier. By trusting the land's signs over the calendar's promises, he saved the rows that mattered most. Dawn revealed how close loss had come, yet how resilience grows in the narrow space between danger and instinct. On the plains, survival is never guaranteed, but knowledge earned in a single night can protect generations. If this frontier fight against the frost pulled you into the night alongside Isaac, don't keep the experience to yourself. Pass it along to someone who'd appreciate real wilderness grit. And if you want more journeys where survival meets history and every decision holds weight, make sure you're here the next time we step onto the frontier. Stories like this are only the beginning. Stick with us, and the prairie will open its secrets one trail at a time.